So the first question was, I'm told, says the author, it's an age-old dilemma of the existence of good and morals and God. And the questions from this follow. If you have two doors, and Hashem came down and told you you were going through door number 1, but at that moment you chose door number 2, it's not good? Is not God supposed to be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-seeing of the future events? So since he knows what door I will go through, but tells me door 1, but at that moment I choose door 2 because of my free will, now
how come God didn't tell you that?
Now, how come God did not tell me to go through door 2, since he knew that, that I was going to go through?
He told you door 1.
Then I could have done door 1. It's a dilemma.
It's a dilemma, yeah.
So, this is the age-old question of the paradox of predestination and free will. If God is all-knowing and knows the future before it happens, then how could we have free will and the ability to change the future? That's the essence of the question. So there's a couple of things to address. First of all, since God is the creator of not just morality, which we'll get to later, but God is the creator of time itself, that the issue of when you decide to do something or not decide something is not an issue for God, because God is living in all time zones, the past, the future, and the present, simultaneously. This is a hard thing for us to get our head around, granted. But even harder to get our head around is that a paradox by its definition is something that we cannot understand. And there are many such, and some of them are quite silly. For instance, can God create a rock that he cannot lift?
I've heard this one, yeah.
So, you mean he's not creative enough to create such a heavy rock he cannot lift? Or he's so creative, but he's too weak and he can't lift it? So, you can get into these conversations, right? But what it's actually telling you is not about the limitations of God. It's telling you about the limitations of the human mind. You can have many explanations for how this process works, but the bottom line is that it is contradictory. And we have a lot of trouble living with contradictions because we see a very finite part of the universe. God sees the entire universe, way beyond what we can even imagine. And if God were dealing with most of these kind of issues that you've described, then he really wouldn't be God. He'd be some combination of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Albert Einstein. He wouldn't really be God. He'd just be like Superman. But God is in a different ballpark. We've talked about it before. You know, when you get the largest number in the world, a Google, and you multiply it by a Google and you get a Googleplex, it's not closer to infinity than number 1, right? You still cannot make that bridge, right? The finite and the infinite are two separate worlds that you cannot bridge. That you have an infinite quality within yourself is not that you're bridging to God with your finite self. Your finite self isn't bridging to God. It's the infinite part of you, there's a part of your creation that bridges to God. So this whole question of, you know, do I really have free will if God knows what I'm going to do? And more so, since I have free will, can I change what God's plan is? So you could say, well, you could change what God's plan is, but God is infinitely adaptable and has all the possible permutations of the things that could happen as part of his game plan. So you may have changed the route, right? But God knows where the road will end up. You know, somebody once told me, a close friend, that we don't have free will. but God wants us to act like we have free will. He really does want us to make choices, but He tells us He wants us to make the right choices anyway. It's not like He's leaving us up in the air. So I think the bottom line here is to say you're trying to understand the mind of the infinite with a very finite mind, and you won't accomplish it. You can jab at it, but you're never going to get quite there. And that issue of predestination and free will is something that is always part of the Jewish psyche. So then the person goes on to ask, about dilemmas. So here he describes a dilemma. It says, it's generally agreed that whatever God wills is good and just. By the way, that's not necessarily true. And I want to back up to the previous thing as well. Okay. Right? Because the first question was, and God came down and told you that you're going through door number 1, but at that moment you chose door number 2. Well, that wouldn't happen. If God told you face to face that you're going through door number 1, there's a question whether you would live long enough to do it. Because nobody speaks with God and survives. We know the story of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
We also know that when God is unveiled in His elemental self, in the purest form of the Creator of the universe, then free will disappears. Some argue that in the times of Mashiach that we won't have any free will. Right? Now that sounds depressing, but it actually isn't depressing, because free will is actually a constant challenge. Right? How much nicer it would be to be in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, without having any choice but to sit and to learn Torah and to be in the light of the Shekhinah, of God's presence, right? And just doing all those wonderful things that God had intended for us to do them, right? And to do them with ease and with pleasure. That would be much better than deciding, am I supposed to eat that or am I not supposed to eat that? Am I supposed to do this? Am I supposed to do that? That's plan B. Plan A is much nicer. And plan A doesn't involve free will, actually. It involves following God's will. When God came to the Jews and said, okay, here's my Torah, if you want it, good. If not, I'm going to drop this mountain on you and you'll be buried here. Right? We understand that they were accepting the Torah, under pressure. Right? So was that fair? Right? Chazal, the sage, is right that it wasn't really that he was going to drop the mountain on him. It was that when God is revealed so clearly that we lose our free will. We just do as He said. So in this situation, you couldn't have chosen door 2. God goes to a great deal of trouble to veil His entity so that we can violate His law and make the decision not to. So that we can choose to say God exists. For the Jews at the Yam Suf, they said they saw the finger of God. Well, they weren't actually saying, I saw this finger, that finger, that finger, the whole hand and arm, right? They weren't saying that. They were saying that God has revealed in His most elemental form to us, right? And under those conditions, there's only one way to it. But for us, in the world we live in, God specifically veils Himself on many, many levels. If heaven forbid a person, touches a 12-volt battery with both fingers, they'll get a shock and get pushed away. That's generally true even with 120 volts. Right? But when you get to 550 volts, you don't get pushed away. Your reflex is actually to grab, and that kills you. When power leaves the generator, it leaves at tremendously high voltages which would blow out any light bulbs you have in your home. Right? There are some industrial environments where they use very high voltage bulbs. They're more efficient, and also if somebody decides to take them home, they don't really work in his home thing, so it prevents theft as well, I'm told. But the way we deal with God is at a very low voltage, right? And that's intended so that we can make the ultimate choice: does God exist? God allows us to make this choice. Right? But in this description here, when God comes right, mano a mano, so to speak, face to face, you're going to choose the door that God tells you to choose. Those conditions. So the next question. Right? It's generally agreed that whatever God wills is good and just. First of all, that's not accurate. Right? We hold that whatever God does is just, is good. Right? We don't always know why it's good. So there's some terrible things that have happened in the Jewish history, and it's very hard for us to understand what could be good about it. But we also understand that, we've just finished learning the death of Yaakov. It said that Yaakov was going to reveal the Kates, the end of time. Right? It wasn't simply he was going to say Mashiach will come in the year 22 whatever, it's going to be 4,000 years from now. Because if that's what he had said, the Jews would have said 4,000 years.
Yeah, it's a long time, yeah.
Without revelation, without Mashiach. We're going to go for another way. Right? That wasn't the revelation of the end of times. It was the revelation of all of history and all of the significance of history, so that the awful things that happened to the Jews would suddenly be understood in a way that we can't understand them. We accept them without understanding them today. This way of thinking, right, is to say that God, by his definition, what he does is good. It doesn't always feel good. Sometimes the mashal is given of a child. When a parent says, no more candy, from the child's point of view, the parent is being very mean. From the parent's point of view, he's helping the child from 6 hours of stomachache. Very painful stomachache, trips to the dentist, drilling and pain, all kinds of stuff that, a craziness in his head from too much sugar. Those are all the things going through the parent's mind. The last thing the parent is thinking is, I'm the enemy of this child. It would be much easier for the parent to say, have another piece of candy. Right? Everybody's happy, right? But the parent is trying very hard to preserve the welfare of the child. Sometimes the parent has to do that, right? That's called din, gevura, judgment, strength. Right? We would always like it to be chesed, kindness, but sometimes we also need din. Right? The whole story of the enslavement in Mitzrayim seems terribly unjust, in a way. But we explained that it was a requirement that we be there. There was a prophecy that would have happened. But Chazal give 3 reasons why it happened. Right? One was that and they all happened to Abraham. See if I can remember them all. One was that when Abraham went to fight the war with the 4 kings who had defeated the 5 kings, he recruited students to fight with him. The second one was when God promised him the land in the I think it was prophecy between the parts. Abraham asked for proof that this would happen, that his children would inherit the land. The third one was on the way back from the war, when he had conquered the people of Sodom. They were offered to him by the king of Sodom, and he said he didn't want to accept it. He didn't want to accept anything from this king, including that. Which meant that, so if we look at it, what's the relationship between all of them? The first one of the story between the parts is obvious. God said, this is what I'm going to do for you and your children. And Abraham had the chutzpah to say, what's the proof? Right? Give me a sign. Right? If God's speaking to you,
you should believe it.
You probably should trust him.
Yeah.
Second one was, Abraham felt that things were such an emergency that things were so endangered that the chances of his success against the four kings were so risky that rather than trust in God and do what God had told him to do, which was to get his nephew back, Lot, he decided, I better take people away from learning Torah to go fight. Which was a sign of lack of faith that on the part of Abraham that he would achieve his ends. The third one was a situation where he'd already conquered the people, and the king who was now in control of said, my people are for you. You can do with them what you want. Abraham had a chance to teach them the lessons of monotheism, of Hashem.
Yeah, it was a big project for that.
He didn't do it. And he didn't do it. So all of them, maybe he felt that, I just can't, I won't succeed, so I'm not going to start. All of these have one thing in common. They show in a man who is loved tremendously by God, who is willing to sacrifice his son, his only son, the one he loves so dearly, the one who is the future of his venture. Not his only son, Ishmael is also his son, but I mean the son that's due to inherit. All those things, and yet he harbors a small doubt. And we see it in these three instances. And for the people that are to be the flag bearers for God's message, this little bit of doubt is very dangerous. When a rocket is launched to the moon lander it used to be, they would have a thing on the way, about halfway. They would say, we're doing a mid-course correction. You know this phrase, mid-course correction? So how far off was the rocket before the mid-course correction? Tiny percentage. I think less than 1%. But if you're off less than 1% at launch, it means you could miss the moon by thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles and be out of the lunar orbit, right? So once you've left the Earth's orbit and you're on your way towards the moon, then it has to be perfect. You have to be going right for the center of the bullseye, right? And if you don't make this mid-course correction, you're not just going to be off the edge, you'll be completely out in space. So it was required, whenever they were doing this, to have this mid-course correction. That's what Mitzrayim was a mid-course correction. The Jews that descended from Abraham had to have a perfect emunah, a perfect faith, in order to carry God's message and to carry it through all the tsuras that they would carry it, all the hardship they would carry it. And Mitzrayim was the furnace through which their steel became hardened, and they were prepared for their mission to carry God's word to the world. So the whole issue of emunah, of faith, right, is central to us. So here the question is God, a statement is made, God is good and just. God, we understand, is good. He's actually not just, right? If God was just, none of us would survive. God gives us a rule book to play by, and none of us do it. Some of us come closer than others, but we all, what tzaddik is there that hasn't fallen 7 times and gotten up, right? Who is beyond ever having committed an avera? For everybody, Yom Kippur is very important. So God is not just. God mixes justice with mercy, with Rahmanas. If God was purely just, we would be destroyed, right? So God understood that he had to, for the world to exist, for man to exist, for man to make choices in this world, that he has to be long-suffering. He has to sometimes wait until the day before death, before a person comes to grips with his mistakes and corrects them. So there's the 13 attributes of mercy. Those are not justice. Those are layered on top of justice for God to say, here's how I can make an exception. Kindness. So the statement at the beginning here, as we understand it, that God is good and just, is wrong. God is good and merciful, right? And justice is something that is tempered by mercy always. So there remains a question. So as we go from here on in, it's a question whether, since the premise is not correct, whether the questions can be valid. But let's see. But there remains the question whether it is good and just, moral, because God wills it, or God wills it because it is good and just and moral, right? So this is, to me, a bizarre question, right? Because it's as if to say morality somehow created God. That morality existed before God did, and God came onto the scene and said, okay, I have to do what morality tells me to do. In which case, morality is God, and God is secondary, right? We don't believe that at all. We believe, very clearly, but there remains a question whether it is good and just because God wills it, and the answer is yes. It is good and just for that reason. Or is it because, or God wills it because it's good and just, right? So what God does is he does reward good as he defines it, right? And he punishes that which is not just as he defines it, right? But what this is leading to is a very strange question of is there an objective good in this world, or is all good relative, right? And the answer is there's clearly an objective good. And more than that, we know what it is. We know what it is. So now here are the problems with answering these two questions, says the author. If there are moral standards independent of God's will, and there are not such things, there's nothing independent of God's will, right? A blade of grass does not grow without the will of God. But the question is asked, if there are moral standards that are independent of God's will, his goodness on the extent to which he conforms to an independent moral standard, thus God is not absolutely independent. These moral standards would limit God's power, for even God could not oppose them by commanding what is evil and thereby making it good. Right? Well, what the person is saying is true, except the premise is false, right? Is that and the point is well made by the author, right? And that is that these standards would limit God's power, right? So by definition, that's not possible, right? Nothing not only limits God's power, nothing limits God at all, right? Which is our biggest problem, is that Rambam says that you can only describe God in the negative, not in the positive. You can't say God is stronger than Arnold Schwarzenegger, that God is smarter than Albert Einstein, because that implies there's some relationship between the intelligence of Albert Einstein and God. Whereas God is the creator of intelligence, right? It's not that he has an unlimited amount of it, right? It's that he created it. It's like his intelligence is way beyond what we even know to be intelligence. It's a different kind of intelligence. It's as if to say, I have a calculator here, right? And over here I have the world's most sophisticated computer. No, that's not even good. See, it's almost impossible to do this. I have a child with 4 rocks over here, right? Yeah. And somebody just invented the greatest computer in the world, right? And the two are not related at all. But as you can see, they actually are related, right? The computer is just degrees greater than the 5 rocks, right? God is not degrees greater than the computer. God is a different ballgame, right? And so God is not only his power not limited, Nothing is limited, and nothing defines God except in the negative, right? Because we say God is, trying to think of a negative definition. God is not smaller than a tree. That's hard to say, because maybe God is smaller than a tree if He wants to be. I don't know. It's very hard to define God. The one that's most commonly used is that God is the cause of all things and has no cause Himself. And I think that's the safest one to go with. God could not command anything opposed to them, and being the morality, and no choice but to command in accordance with this existing morality. Thus God has no free will regards to being good, and must command according to this pre-existing morality. So obviously there's no application here. Right? By definition, you're not talking about God. Right? If there are moral standards independent of God, then morality would retain its authority even if God did not exist. Thus God is not required from moral standards eliminating necessity of God as a moral arbiter. This of course is in fact true where men set themselves up as gods. Right? This is almost the definition of paro.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing.
If there are moral standards independent of God's will, then there is something over which God is not sovereign. God is bound by the laws of morality instead of being their establisher. And my note here was, this God is not my God. Right? This God is, I don't know, He's not a very big God. In fact, we know that most people are not bound by morality. How can you bind God, the Creator? So now is better questions, because it's more on track with where we are. Right? If their moral standards are not independent of God's will, that is to say, God is the Creator. Without a moral standard other than God's will, then God's commands are arbitrary, based on pure whims or capriciousness. This means there are no objective morals. Now, I don't know how the author comes to that conclusion, right? Without a moral standard other than God's will, as if to say God's will is not significant.
Yeah, that's the trick. Yeah.
And God's commands are arbitrary. Well, God's commands are not arbitrary. God's commands are based on the proper running of the universe. Really.
They're perfect.
They are perfect for the cause for which God has created them. Right? To say they are based on pure whims or capriciousness is somebody who is, again, living in the world of, Louis XIV in France. I don't know where somebody can use the word capricious, when talking about the entity that created the human child. When talking about the entity that created chlorophyll to make things grow. When talking about the entity that creates the law of gravity or centrifugal force. It's capricious. It's not capricious. It's complex beyond our ability to absorb. It's almost the opposite of capricious. I don't know from where that phrase comes. And not only that, right? But God carefully crafts His moral system, and then Baruch Hashem gives it to us as a gift on a silver platter. How much more difficult it would be if we're trying to figure out how to do something good, how to avoid something bad, even if that's what we wanted to do. Right? This means there are no objective morals. It's actually the opposite. This means there are only objective morals. Right? Right? What those morals are take a lot of learning. Right? They're not always easy. Thou shalt not kill. We do kill. We're permitted to kill. Right? Self-defense, war, right? You shouldn't murder. It's a different kind of killing, right? Different kind of killing, right? That's forbidden, right? Well, a court sometimes has to murder, right? Representing the people. Right? What does it mean, right? So it's not a simple process to understand God's will, but to think that our lack of understanding indicates a subjectivity is a foolishness on a dangerous level. Right? Our go and learn. That's what I would tell this person. Go and learn, right? We do not believe in subjective good. We believe in complex good. Not complicated. Complex. Right? But at the heart, it's very clear cut. Once you've learned it, it's very clear cut. It's not an issue. Right?
You're on the second arbitrariness.
Yeah.
We also mean.
And I should add, that doesn't necessarily mean that two moral positions do not necessarily conflict. They do sometimes conflict. And, we have, on KosherTube, there are Rabbi Torchiner and Rabbi Berzon in many ways specialize on those questions. Questions of a conflict of halacha, an apparent conflict of halacha, but that they do always have a solution at the end of the day. So sometimes, you need the advice of a very knowledgeable Rav to understand what is good in a given situation, what is right, what the correct action is. But one should never think that it's a subjective process. It is a difficult process to learn what is the right answer. But there is a right answer. Secondly, arbitrariness would also mean that anything could become good and anything could become bad, merely upon God's command. By the way, this is actually true. Inflicting pain or incest can become good at a simple command. In principle, one could say that's true, right? But God is not like man, and says this numerous times in Tanakh, right? Mm-hmm. God keeps his promises. God is unchangeable. And the Torah that was given at Har Sinai is the same Torah that, 1,000 years before Abraham was keeping. It is the same Torah that we keep. It is the same Torah that will be kept after Mashiach comes. Right? It is God's blueprint for the universe, and it is unchanging. Is it adaptable? Infinitely adaptable. There was no cell phone when the Torah was written. Was it anticipated? Yes. Of course. Right? There was no automobile. Was it anticipated? Yes. Many of the questions that we have today, we think to ourselves, there's questions about I won't get off track. I'll stay on this for now. But the questions that we ask today are often questions that were asked in the Gemara. Mm. And we're surprised. Questions about behavior in public places. Who should ride in the back of the bus? Mm-hmm. Those questions actually were asked and dealt with before, and we should pay attention to what the answers our sages gave us, rather than make up what we think God wants. Right? God wrote it down. Mm-hmm.
Told us.
You don't need to make it up if it's there in writing. Again, I have to emphasize, it doesn't mean that it's a simple reading. Mm-hmm. Right? It means learning. But to think that it's not there, that we're at sea, is a terrible misunderstanding. So the idea of inflicting pain or incest or any of those kinds of things, those things that are commanded for us not to do, don't change. There doesn't come a time where it says, oh, okay, Now that we have refrigeration, we can eat pork. Right? It doesn't change. Right? It's not because of refrigeration, it's because of God's will. Moral obligations derive from commanding authority. However, since moral standards are not independent of God's will, there is no overarching authority. It's a very strange statement. Let me read it again, because I don't understand it. Right? We began by saying here, if there are moral standards are not independent of God's will, right? This is moral obligations derive from commanding authority. However, since moral standards are not independent of God's will, there's no overarching authority. Who's God? God is the overarching authority. I don't understand the question here at all. Right? If He required obedience, and God does require obedience, it is only from His irresistible power. No, that's not true, actually. You know, the desire of Josiah to please you is not simply because he fears, oh, if I don't please Tati, he will yell at me, or heaven forbid, he'll spank me. You know, he wants to please you because he loves you, and he wants to be like you. You're his example of, this is actually a muscle for our relationship with God. There was no reason to have families. You know, the universe could have been created without families. Right? The idea of children, mothers, and fathers is a way of understanding our relationship with God. The punishments we get, the rewards we get, all those things for adults from God. We learn these things as children, and we employ them with our own children. It's a mashal, it's a metaphor for something much greater, which is our complex relationship with God. So, if He required obedience, it's only from His irresistible power. No. It's actually from our desire to be like Him, is really what it is. We want to be godlike. Right? Do we feel best when we withdraw from other people? Do we feel best when we do mean things? Sometimes we do mean things because we're selfish. After we've been selfish, do we feel good? We actually feel very bad after we've been selfish. You know? When somebody who you don't like is going to come to your house for Shabbos. Right? It happens. You know, you're tired, you don't, and it's somebody who you're concerned for their welfare, so you know you should invite them. They're very pleased you invite them, so you invite them, they come, right? You're really wishing they didn't show up, right? And, you know, if they didn't show up, you feel terrible inside. And if they did show up, and you have the opportunity to make their Shabbos special, they actually made your Shabbos special by this opportunity. Why? Because you were being godlike, you were giving. Because God requires nothing. Everything is God's and He requires nothing. He is the cause of everything and has no cause, right? That at the moment we act that way, we feel very good. Very good. Some would call it self-righteous, right? Hopefully not. Hopefully it is an attempt to be like our Maker in the quality of giving and the quality of chesed. Right? So if our only motivation is that we think, if I eat that cheeseburger, when I go outside, for sure, a bolt of lightning is going to come out of the sky and strike me dead. So I'm not going to eat the cheeseburger. Well, it's good you didn't eat the cheeseburger. Well, that's a good thing, right? But it's certainly not the best reason to. A better reason to be would be, you know, the cheeseburger looks really tasty and I'm hungry. But God, who gives me everything, says that this is something that I shouldn't have. Right? So, A, I don't want to disappoint Him. Right? And B, He's probably got a good reason. It doesn't have to do with the fact He wants the cheeseburger. Right? He's not short on cheeseburgers. Yeah. Right? It has to do with something else. Right? My welfare. You know, we're now, you know, the Alter Rebbe and others said that that we should live with the Parsha. Where are we in the Parsha? We're about to enter enslavement. And as we enter the book of Shmos, of Exodus, right? And the end of the enslavement, which happens about halfway through the book, we talk about our freedom. You know, Zman Chirasenu, the time of our freedom, right? Leaving Egypt. In some ways it's a misstatement, because at our most glorious moments we describe Moshe Rabbeinu, we describe David HaMelech as an Eved Hashem, a slave of God. A servant of God is a nicer word. So, shouldn't we just be talking about being free? No. We actually exchanged two forms of servitude. One was to somebody whose only interest was in their own pleasure and their own power. And he was the epitome of this quality. Of, that he felt ill, and so the cure for his ill was to bathe in the blood of Jewish children. Right? That's the kind of morality that happens when man determines subjective morality. Right? He didn't do it because he thought he was evil. He thought he was doing the best thing he could for Egypt, was taking good care of Paro. Right? What's good for General Motors is good for America. What's good for Paro is good for Mitzrayim. And then we left, right? And we exchanged the yoke of servitude in the house of bondage to Paro to the yoke of Torah. It's a yoke. It is a servitude, right? But it is a servitude to a master whose only interest is our welfare and who has unlimited resources to give us the best welfare. All we have to do is follow the blueprint. And Baruch Hashem, he also gave us the blueprint, rather than say, do the best you can, I'll let you know if you
got it right.
When my son, used to, the Seder, look for the matzah, and he was very young, and he couldn't find it, the only solution was to say, you're getting warmer, you're getting warmer, you're getting warmer, right? Oh, colder, 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 warmer, warmer, until you're hot, and he would touch it. They cut the matzah, it was great, right? So, because he couldn't find it on his own at that point. Now he finds it before I hide it, usually. So God did that for us, right? He gave us the Torah, he gave us Chazal, he gave us the Gemara, he gave us the Mishnah, right? He gave us all of the insights that we need from then to eternity. In doing this, right, he gave us a servitude that is actually a paradise. Right? Because you have a master who owns the universe and is only interested in your welfare. And you're going to say, I want to be free of that? Doesn't make sense. Right? So do we do it out of absolute power? The author of this statement is somebody who is comparing God to the most foul kind of dictator, and not understanding what our basic relationship with God. God prefers a relationship of love to year, but his backup plan is fear, right? Because it's harder to be perfect in love than it is to be in fear. But our fear is not a fear of being hit by lightning. That's a childish kind of fear but if I did something wrong, my father would say to me, it's not you. It's disappointing, David. It's not like you. And it was the most painful punishment in the world to see that I did not live up to my potential in my father's eyes. Right? This is actually what we should fear. This is what we should fear. God, who gives us everything, right? And says, do something good for yourself, right? Because I don't actually need you to do a bracha. I don't need you to daven, to go to shul, to give tzedakah. I have it all. You'll be better off if you do it. Do something good for yourself. Right? this is the God that we should fear disappointing more than anything else. Not his irresistible power, which is there, but God God doesn't use his irresistible power. In other words, says the author, might makes right, which is absolutely false. Right? God makes right and tells us what it is. Next, if good is to be defined as what God commands, then the goodness of God himself is emptied of meaning, and the commands of an omnipotent fiend would have the same claim on us as those of a righteous God. Again, the person is not talking about God. The person is talking about the most foul kind of dictators, right? If good is to be defined as what God commands, then the goodness of God himself is emptied of meaning. Why?
He's comparing the fact that if God makes commands, then someone who's not another being, entity, or not essentially as a nice person, could also make commands, and what's the difference? Okay, that's what he's suggesting, this author.
So first of all, God's goodness is self-evident.
Yeah.
We live in a world where we don't keep our part of the bargain more often than not, and God says, I'll give him another chance over and over and over, much more so than we would tolerate with a colleague at work than a child, right? God is constantly saying he intended to do well. Right? So the idea that his goodness is emptied of meaning is a bizarre statement. His goodness is around us every moment of the day. The fact that you continue to breathe is a sign of God's mercy. Not you. Everybody here are tzaddikim, I know that, right? But the fact that I continue to breathe, right? For sure, this is a sign of God's kindness, right? And I'm very aware of that. Anybody who's ever had an encounter with real danger, near-death experiences, expression people sometimes use, right? Understands how God's goodness is self-evident. Right? When we suffer pain, when we suffer loss, the test is very great. But if we are people of faith, we will go through that test and survive it. Whether we live or die, we'll go through it and survive it for the good. It will affect us positively. So he goes on to say, and the command, and so he says, then the goodness of God is emptied of meaning, because I think this comes back to God is capricious. And the commands of an omnipotent fiend would have the same claim on us as those of a righteous God. So if God were not a God, but were some evil entity that was omnipotent, then I guess that would probably be true. But you're not talking about God. You're talking about
the evil entity.
You're talking about something that actually doesn't exist in the universe.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing, because we don't hold that the best example of it is Satan, right? It's some power separate from God. We hold that Satan does God's work. We've talked about this before, that Satan is an officer of the court, so to speak, that he is a tempter, he's somebody who judges us, he's somebody who represents the crown or the state as a prosecutor in our situation. But it's not that he's working in opposition to God. He's actually God's servant in many ways, doing his job. So the question is not really related to anything we can observe in this universe, other than if you're talking about the former dictator of Libya or Iraq or North Korea, these things apply. They don't apply to God. So we come to the last page now, and then it says basically what the above comes down to. This is the summary of a series of things that are wrong. Is if the Torah is moral because Hashem wrote it to be moral, which is correct, Yes, it's to be moral. Mine does. Yes, it's to be moral and objective, and to give us objective moral standards, a blueprint for our lives. Or it is because Hashem used existing morals. This is silly. Of course not. Do we think that morals came together and fashioned God? That's what's going on. Nothing preceded God,
of course,
including morality, right? Which is true. The person says, I argued a lot with this fellow over this one. I consider this above human concepts, and that God wrote the Torah not as a judge who looks at people and cannot be applied this way. But if you think about it, it has to be one of the above. Interesting thought. It is one of the above. It is that God created morality, right? And He created it for our welfare, right? And He created it so that we could live with one another, and that we could understand what it is that our mission is in this world. Do you have any thoughts on these things?
No.
I kind of answered them all, but you said you had some answers.
Well,
are they consistent with what we talked about?
Oh yeah, very much consistent with what we talked about. This is not. those are not my words. These crazy questions.
No, I said it. No, that's why I said.
I don't. That's why my summation is about the fact that God wrote the Torah. The interesting thing, one of the discussions I had with a friend.
By the way, the person who was concerned about this on the other side of this argument believes in something that is actually anathema to Jews.
Is it anathema?
That is a forbidden concept to Jews.
A forbidden concept to Jews.
And that is that there is more than one force in the universe. You know, we talked a few weeks ago about Shema.
Yeah.
Right? That God is one.
That's right.
Right? Not only that, the judge, Elokeinu, that which we see in nature, Elokeinu, right, is really controlled by Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Hashem. And that is a name of mercy, of Rahmanas, of kindness, of infinitude, of the past, the present, and the future. Those are the qualities. Right? That entity, not Shakai, not Elokeinu, but that entity is an entity in which all exists and exists in all. Right? So much of the discussion here is a discussion about dualism. You know, a world in which there are two forces contending. There's a fiendish force and there's a good force. And if the fiendish force has more power than the good force has, then we hold that whatever is the most powerful rules us, then we would accept the morality of the fiendish force. Right? But the fiendish force does not exist independently of God. Right? And a belief system that allows for that is not too distant from a pagan belief of multiple gods and multiple views. You know, when we believe in one God, then there is nothing outside that God. Right? When we believe in more than one God, then everything is up for grabs. Right? This was the difference. You know, we just finished Hanukkah. Right? The Greeks were universalists. If they had a pantheon of 15 gods and you wanted to add the Jewish God to it, 16 gods.
16 gods.
No problem. Just put up another pedestal. You know, let's find a little statue of your God. He probably, has got a long past, whatever, right? You know, and he wears tzitzit. I guess that's what your God looks like. We'll put him there. We'll all worship him. Right? We said we have a problem. And Rabbi Breitowitz likes to point out this is the point that prior to Judaism, there were no wars based on religion. Right? Many people will tell you it's an interesting thing, and they're not that far off. The religion is the cause of war. Right? And there's some truth in that, in the sense that monotheism has an exclusivity to it. If you believe in one God, then you can't add one more and say it's similar. If you believe in 15 gods, you can take that guy's gods and add them to your collection, and everything is fine. So we have a Persian god of rain, and we have a Macedonian god of rain, and they both have the same function. And you worship them your way, I worship my way, right? But they're both at war with the Egyptian god of wind, which is pushing our rain away.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's it's almost hard to imagine because it seems childlike, right? But the fact of the matter is whenever you add one more force into this world, it doesn't have to be a big one. It can be a very small one. It can be, that there's a fox in Colorado that is beyond the will of God, right? And there's people who worship that fox, right? The Fox clan. They worship that fox. Right? That means that they see that there's another power in this world. It may not be a big power, but we don't hold that. There is one power, only one power, always one power. When somebody talks about fiends and those kind of things, talking about things outside of God, right? It's foreign to Judaism. It's foreign to Judaism. And, really it's foreign to, the descendants of Judaism. The origins are descended from Judaism too. There are elements that sometimes filter into those faiths that come from their neighbors. And those need to be corrected periodically. But much of this is really about a dualism that is a misunderstanding of Judaism completely.